Good evening and good morning to all our participants, and thank you so much for joining us today for this discussion on opportunities for subnational leadership in the U.S. and China. My name is Jessica Gordon, and I'm a Senior Climate Policy Fellow at the California-China Climate Institute, and I will be serving as the moderator for today's discussion. Before we begin, I'd just like to offer a few quick housekeeping remarks. We are recording this event, and it will be available later on the California-China Climate Institute's website and also on our YouTube channel. This event is also being simultaneously translated into Mandarin Chinese. So please use the globe icon. You'll see it at the base of your screen and select the preferred language you'd like to listen in, either English or Mandarin. Throughout today's discussion, if you'd like to ask a question of one of our panelists, please type your question into the Q&A function at the base of your screen at any time, and we'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible during today's program. So let's go ahead and get started. Today's discussion is one of a broader series that we've been exploring at the California-China Climate Institute, focused on opportunities for the U.S. and China to take additional climate actions within the 2020s, looking at key topics within the Glasgow Declaration, which was signed at COP26. We've launched an 11-paper series that's focused on various aspects of this issue. So today we'll be focusing on one of those key areas, which is subnational opportunities. And this will feature authors from our recent report, Subnational Climate Action in the U.S. and China, where we are and opportunities for cooperation. We've just put the link in the chat, so we encourage you all to take a look at the report. And so we're very excited today to have the report authors, along with some additional experts from the field, to have a discussion about the opportunities they see coming forward. So now I'm very pleased to introduce our expert panel. So I'll introduce them in the order that they'll be speaking. We have Dr. Fan Dai, who's the director of the California-China Climate Institute, which is co-housed at the Berkeley Law Center for Law, Energy, and Environment, and also at the Rausser College of Natural Resources at UC Berkeley. She's played a significant role in leading California's collaboration with China on climate, energy, and environment. She was appointed by Governor Edmund G. Brown Jr. as a special advisor on China. We also have Professor Joanna Lewis, who is the Provost Distinguished Associate Professor of Energy and Environment and the Director of the Science, Technology, and International Affairs Program at the Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. She has 2 decades of experience working on international climate and clean energy policy with a focus on China. She also has a new book out called Cooperating for the Climate, Learning from International Partnerships in China's Clean Energy Sector, which was recently released, and we encourage you all to read it. Also with us today is Ms. Zhu Xiaoming, who's the director of the Yangtze River Delta Carbon Neutrality Strategic Development Institute at the Southeast University in China. She was formerly the director of the Development and the Reform Commission of Jiangsu Province, the director of the Bureau of Statistics of Jiangsu Province, and the mayor of Zhenjiang City. Director Zhu has long been engaged in development planning and regional and economic and industrial policy and low carbon development strategies. We also have with us today Man Chen, who's the program director and senior analyst at the Institute of Global Decarbonization Progress. Her research focuses on climate change policy analysis and database development, carbon markets, and non-CO2 greenhouse gas emissions mitigation. So we're very happy to have all of you here today. Thank you so much. And now I'll turn it over to Fan to give her remarks. It looks like Fan's having some technical issues here, so maybe Joanna, can I ask you to please go first while we deal with Fan's audio issue?
Of course, no problem.
Okay, thank you.
Maybe in China, so. No, I'm happy to start. Thank you again for the invitation to participate this evening. For my remarks, I plan to focus briefly on three topics. First, the context for bilateral cooperation. Second, excuse me, the particular role of subnational cooperation. And third, where we might focus either new or expanded engagement initiatives going forward. The United States and China have been cooperating in the energy and climate space for many decades. We're now in the 5th decade of substantive cooperation in this area. And over time, we've seen the focus of this cooperation shift, both in terms of the technical issues that we work on, as well as the sort of diplomatic aims of this sort of engagement. And we've seen climate and energy cooperation take place during times of good bilateral relations, as well as during more challenging times. Our cooperation between the United States and China has endured many U.S. presidential administrations, both Republican and Democratic. And clean energy cooperation is really a crucial component of the global climate response and has led to important changes in both of our countries' domestic climate and energy policy. And now, as China has emerged as the largest deployer of most key low carbon energy technologies, I think the U.S. has just as much to learn from China as China has learned from the United States over the past few decades through our engagement. So, as we are now in a difficult period of U.S.-China relations, we've been here before, and I think we can still find important ways to engage on this topic. National level engagement is, of course, important to set the stage for all other engagement, really, whether it's subnational, private sector engagement, non-governmental, academic, et cetera. And I think it's very important that we've seen many U.S. officials travel to China over the last couple of weeks. And now, of course, Special Envoy Kerry is going to be traveling to China this weekend in an attempt to restart the national level engagement. I think Kerry's visit sends a very important signal to the rest of us who work in this space in both China and the United States that essentially we have a green light to engage or to re-engage. And I think there's an important signal these leaders also are sending to the rest of the world. If the US and China can continue to work together on climate change, we can feel much better about prospects for agreement at COP28 in Dubai, for example. And we know that sharing information bilaterally not only increases understanding and transparency, but can also, play a very important role in trust building. We know how to design mechanisms for shifting geopolitical environments. And so I think, we can respond to the current situation. Due to the pandemic, we, of course, lost much of the in-person engagement and exchange, which is so crucial to building a joint understanding of each other's situation and priorities. But I'm hopeful that with conversations like this one, increasing opportunities for constructive engagement, that we are really at the start of getting this back. So in terms of where we can focus, as we say in the report, subnational engagement poses, I think, unique opportunities for U.S.-China cooperation, particularly in the areas where subnationals are really at the forefront of actions and where the national government may have somewhat limited authority. For example, we're seeing the largest coal producing states and provinces in both countries facing similar challenges of implementing a just transition away from coal. This also creates, I think, an opportunity for sharing experiences and best practices of how to balance the socioeconomic and environmental interests at the subnational level, and developing programs to help transform the coal sector workforce. Another example we talk about is the regional and state carbon market exchange and potential opportunities to engage on policy design and implementation, particularly as China is still in the process of launching what will be the largest national carbon market in the world, which was built on multiple subnational carbon markets. And both of these topics, of course, relate to the power sector currently and opportunities for changing regulations to better incentivize low carbon electricity. I think when we see the permitting of new coal plants in China, for example, that seem to be directly undermining national climate goals, this is actually very much a reflection of tensions between central planners and subnational policymakers, who are the ones ultimately responsible for making sure the local economy has the energy it needs to thrive. And so failure to engage subnationally can ignore many of the real implementation challenges, both, I think, technical and political, associated with the low carbon transition that we see, I think, playing out right now in real time in both countries. In some cases, again, in the China context, we see some provinces that lag central government goals, but in other places, we see provinces and municipalities that are far ahead of central government goals. For example, as we talk about in the report, Guangdong's renewable energy goals exceed national goals, as do Shanghai's new energy vehicle goals, or Jiangsu's building efficiency goals, or Sichuan's industrial efficiency goals. And of course, we see very similar dynamics in the United States, where California has long played a crucial role in demonstrating that ambitious policies can work. And then that allows them to push the rest of the country forward across a variety of environmental issues. And now, most notably, of course, climate policy, renewables, electric vehicles. And then, of course, there's other states, on the other side of this that are still resisting and lagging national climate goals. So, I think ultimately subnational engagement can play a very important role in highlighting these subnational dynamisms that are really influencing and in some cases accelerating the national climate response, and as a result, the international climate response. This is, of course, the decade of action, the pivotal decade when it comes to addressing climate change by acting on the goals that countries have already articulated. Implementation is key here, and ultimately much of that will fall on state, provincial, and local governments to achieve. So failing to engage at this level, I think, risks undermining the achievements the U.S. and China have already achieved bilaterally, and as a result, global progress on climate change. I'll stop there and look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Joanna, for those great remarks. And I'd like to invite you back. See if the audio is working.
Thanks, Jessica, and apologies for the audio glitch that I have. So yeah, I think I have heard Joanna's remarks and pretty much want to echo what she said. And as we kind of work together on the paper, we outlined those recommendations, and also just kind of to add very briefly my observation and recommendation on the areas that, in addition to what Joanna mentioned, I think particularly this year, the area of climate adaptation and resilience, as we understand that China, after it published its national adaptation strategy for 2035, a lot of those provinces and cities are at the front for a lot of extreme climate, extreme heat events and other extreme climate events impact. And last we think those subnationals, both in the U.S. and in China, are taking their actions and making their plans towards building up climate resilience and more solid adaptation from those different levels. So I think adaptation and resilience also would be a really important area for subnationals to drive a lot of the planning and actions from both sides. And just adding another example, like methane emission reduction, we have at the Institute produced a few reports and papers and research on methane reduction already, and some of those conclusions actually pointing to actions being taken at the subnational level or very local level, particularly like the sector including waste, landfills and agricultural sectors that we see a lot of positive impact that could be brought by the subnationals. And this is again another area that was also highlighted in the U.S.-China joint statement at Glasgow. So I think there are some emerging new areas of cooperation for subnationals and between the U.S. and China to focus on. I think Joanna already mentioned quite a few of those are in terms of the energy sector decarbonization, as well as carbon market actions that could be, we could probably see more opportunities for collaboration and learning from each other in terms of what both are doing in those areas. I think I would pause my comments there for now, and I would love to hear more our other panelists in terms of their view and updates they see from China and the US on those actions. Thanks.
Thanks, Fan. Zhu Xiaoming, Zhu 老师, please go ahead.
Hello, 大家好，很高兴参加今天的研讨会，感谢戴主任的引荐。我呢，在这个东南大学太空研究院在推动这个碳中和的中国的双碳的有关工作。我现在呢就把这个中国的从2022年到2022年，总书记习近平总书记在联合国75这个人大会议上把中国的双碳目标提出来以后，我们中国地方做了哪些工作？第一个呢，就是我们地方应该来说在强化这个顶层设计，这可能是中国做事的一些方式方法。所以这个像国家明确了1+N的这个体系，那么江苏呢印发了2022年印发了江苏碳达峰的实施方案，江苏省“十四五”应对气候变化的规划，还有一个关于推动高质量发展做好双碳工作的实施意见等等，还有我们的工业领域碳达峰的实施方案，科技支撑双碳的实施方案，城乡建设的实施双碳的实施方案，这是作为省一级产业。那么在地方还有市，比如说南京市就编制了南京市2030年前二氧碳达峰行动方案，南京市“4+5”低碳发展规划，南京市数字低碳循环发展3年行动计划。苏州呢也制定出来了苏州市碳达峰的实施方案，苏州市的工信局还研究起草苏州市工业领域重点行业的碳达峰的实施方案。这是我想给大家首先介绍一下中国的一些目标出来，一定要把这个顶层设计要设计好。这是一。第二个呢，你像我们研究院也在做一些这个支撑的一些技术研究工作，因为对于地方政府来说的话，他们可能很少有这样一些拥有这么多的双碳方面的人才，而学校里面是有这样一些人才，所以我们在学校里重点给地方政府给绿色转型的企业这个提供一些解决的方案，所以我们也做了一系列的这样一些工作。第二个呢，就是这个他们已经作为这个双碳目标提出来以后，正值是“十四五”规划的实施之年，所以呢，在这个一个是总要的指标已经纳入“十四五”规划，第二个呢，就是他们已经从这2年中期提出来看，“十四五”中期前提出来看，已经取得了一些初步的成效。比如说江苏省本省的地区生产总值二氧化碳排放比2001年累计下降超过了55%。虽然我们还没有达到碳达峰，但是这个二氧化碳的排放，就是这个单位地区生产总值的二氧化碳排放已经下降。10年间，江苏呢平均下降碳排放下降2.4%。那么生态环境质量呢也有所改善。2022年 PM2.5 的年均浓度为32微克米，实现了2013年以来的9年降，每年都在下降。我们也是 这个作为生活在南京的老百姓，也感受到这个大气质量这持续的这样一个变化。还有就是能源结构也在不断的优化，煤炭消费从2010年的占到64.5%，下降到2021年的55.3%。这个非化石能源的消费比重达到12.3%，比2010年提高了6.8个百分点。工业的节能降碳成效也比较明显。“十三五”期间，全省共有12家企业入围国家能效的领跑者名单，重点实施节能项目332项，年节能205万吨标准。还有绿色节能建筑稳步推进，绿色交通体系加快建设，生态系统碳汇能力持续增强。这是中国我们这些地方城市已经有取得的一些成效。这是我想给大家介绍的第二个。第三个方面呢，中国在按照这个就是中国，因为中国是个大国，而且我们的体制跟美国是不一样的。但是我觉得我非常深深的感受到中美之间在应对气候变化方面加强合作，寻找一些合作的领域和一些合作的这个空间是非常有益的。那么中国呢，因为中国我们是这个共产党领导的一党执政的这样一个长期的一党执政，所以我们呢有我们在推进这个方面有我们自己中国的特色。我给他总结的叫推进中国看中国的方法论，实际上就是5句话。第一句话呢，就是摸清家底，就是无论是你这个国家，还是你这个城市，还是你这个地区，都得把你的碳排放的家底一定要搞清楚，哪些是你的碳源，哪些是你的碳汇，这个要搞清楚。第二个呢，就要找个途径，因为碳排这个双碳，特别是碳中和，它涉及的领域非常广泛。这个我们中国的中央文件上已经讲清楚，它是一场经济社会系统性变革的一件事情，所以它们涉及的方方面面，所以这个当中一定要找途径。这个把到底是能源、交通、工业、城市、建筑、农村、碳汇等等这样一方面，都得把这个在什么时间回到2060年的目标，大概在什么时间我们这个地方能够实现这个某个领域什么时间实现碳这个零碳，然后到2060年的时候，整个我们这个城市、我们这个地区能够实现零碳。第三个呢，就是明确措施，因为是目标有了，路径有了，关键你怎么去做，这个东西一定要有一些的措施。比如说，我们政府就要出台一些指标体系啊，你怎么考？你这个当地这个上级怎么来考核你？像最近我们国家习近平总主席已经讲了，就是要逐渐的实现由原来的能源双控变成碳双控，一个是碳的强度，一个是碳，还要慢慢过渡到这个碳的双控，就是这样的类似这样的一些指标，在我们的规划，在我们的各级政府对下级政府的考核当中都要有一些体现。第二呢，就是技术攻关的清单，因为双碳的这样没有创新实现不了碳，而这个当中有非常多的技术需要创新，比如说我们的储能，比如说提高太阳能的光电转化效率，比如说电池的这个稳定性、安全性，核电池的等等一系列的技术非常之广泛，所以这个一定要我们政府和大学各重点攻关攻什么？第三个呢，就是要有政策性，就财政政策、税收政策，我们的这个投资政策、金融政策，未来是什么？要有些政策，怎么来鼓励它们？因为目前你从高碳转向低碳到零碳的时候，它的确会增加企业的成本，也会增加全社会的成本。那么这个成本怎么消化？包括技术攻关，你技术攻关你钱从哪里来？怎么来去做？所以这些东西都要有一些政策的支撑。第四个呢，就是金融支撑。金融是投资的领域，我们作为做好双碳工的一个非常重要的方面。但是金融怎么支撑？支撑到怎么样？怎么设计好？所以这些也需要。第五个呢，就是法律。双碳领域涉及到很多的这个老百姓的事情，社会的系统变，所以这个社会层面上需要法律来先行。我们有些城市 都已经像无锡市都已经委托我们研究院专门研究了他们在双碳领域当中，他们作为这个城市应该率先出台的一些法律，在这个当中，所以他们已经做了一些，都开始就是前期开始做一些准备了。还有就是你们讲的就是用好这个交易手段，因为交易是市场化配置资源的，就是在双碳领域，它是一个重要的政策。怎么用好这个交易手段，包括这个碳市场，包括我们讲绿色用能，包括我们的这个碳汇等等价值，怎么来用好，这个都是要都要进行设计。最后一个呢就是试点示范，因为我们现在到离碳中和，我们是2060年实现碳中和，我们离碳中和的目标还是比较远，还几十年。所以在这个当中，目前要干什么？目前对于我们来说，就是要做一些试点示范，把试点示范的东西实践去分析，在试点当中找到我们的问题，适合我们政策，哪些政策可行稳定下去，哪些技术可行，我们可以产业化要把试等等这样去做一些事情。那么这是这个明确措施方面，然后在第4句话叫合力做，因为这件事情不是哪一个部门能做好，一定要全社会都要动起来。所以我们中央有专门的文件出台了这个文件来指导大家怎么来有序的推动双碳这个工作。最后一个呢就是形成体制，形成什么样的体制呢？新型的能源体系、产业低碳转型的体系、绿色技术的创新体系，还有绿色投资体系。最后一个就是现代化管理体系。我就汇报到这些。我觉得我们跟美国之间、中美之间，在这个方面真的有非常非常多的合作。我们在这个研究路径的时候，实际上也得到了戴主任给我们大力支持。我们向你们学习了很多，就是这个康养模型、投资实验室的指导。
Thank you so much, Zhu Laoshi, for those great remarks. And now I'd like to invite our next panelist, Megan Chen, to give her remarks.
Thank you, Jessica. I have a slide I would like to share. Can you see the slides?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, my remarks is going to focus on our research work in China's subnational climate actions. So early this year, we released a report trying to understand China's subnational climate actions at the provincial level. We have a look at the subnational mitigation performance in the 13th five-year plans, and also the subnational climate actions towards 2025. We also have identified the emission gaps these provincial regions probably have to achieve carbon neutralities. So for data availability, we only focus on 30 provincial regions. China's provincial regions actually is highly diverse in terms of their economic development, energy mix, and resource endowment. So if we look at the per capita CO2 emissions by provincial regions, we have some provincial regions that actually has pretty high per capita CO2 emissions than ones of the United States. But we also have a lot of provincial regions that have per capita CO2 emissions that are lower than ones of the European Union. So that is the same for carbon intensities. We saw we have for example, we have Inner Mongolia that has pretty high carbon intensities, which is probably bigger, 7 times bigger than carbon intensities like in Beijing. Given this regional diversity, that can lead to different decoupling progress. So currently, from our analysis, we saw 1/3 of China's provincial regions actually can see clear decoupling of carbon emissions and GDP growth in the past 5 years. The past 5 years, we mean the 13th five-year plan, and which means in these regions, their total economic growth have been achieved while their total carbon emissions actually has remained stable or even decreased. So we also had a look at this is their subnational mitigation performance for the 13th five-year plans. So here we saw like carbon emissions per capita actually have increased in 20 provincial regions. If we look at the map, most regions actually we saw the increase in eastern and the south regions, because those regions actually are well-developed, like economic developed regions and with high population. And we also saw 21 regions actually have overperformed on their carbon intensity reduction targets. So we also have a look at the mitigation performance in key sectors. So in the energy sector, we saw in the eastern regions that they lead in growth of renewable energy installation, such as Shandong, Hebei, and Jiangsu. And in western regions, we saw renewable energy installation actually is growing in parallel with coal power installation, such as like Xinjiang, Ningxia, and Inner Mongolia. And in industry, in industry sector, we saw there is a reduction in the energy consumption in the industry value added. But in the building sector and also the transportation sectors, for most provincial regions, we saw their energy consumption per capita actually are increasing for the 13th five-year plan period. So in our report, we also looked at the provincial climate actions towards 2025. So as we know, China actually already established the 1+N climate policy framework for carbon peaking and carbon neutralities. So to implement these climate targets, the local government actually is going to develop their local 1+N climate policy system. So what we saw here is the local dual carbon policy deployment is making progress and covering key areas such as energy, industry, transportation, and buildings. We saw like there are like 30, for example, we have like 22% of policies actually focused on cross sector, and 16% of policies focus on energy sectors. But if we look at the climate targets, those provincial regions actually set up, we think they only get moderate comprehensive climate targets, because only a small number of provincial regions actually show ambitions to peak their carbon emissions earlier than 2030, and also to have like carbon intensity reduction targets that are higher than the national targets. A lot of provincial regions only use the language of like follow the central government's requirements in their to set up their carbon intensity reduction targets. However, for the energy intensity reduction targets, we saw a lot of provincial regions actually they set these targets that are higher than the national levels. And we also see the ambitious sector-specific climate actions at the provincial level. For example, for the new announced targets for the non-fossil fuel share increase, we saw a lot of like, if we do the calculation, actually we can see China, if we put these targets together, we see China actually could meet its 2030 renewable targets at least 5 years earlier. In the building sectors, we saw like over half of China's provincial regions actually are implementing or developing building codes for ultra low energy buildings or near zero energy buildings. These actually are more ambitious than the national requirements, because for the national requirements, you only ask for the the provincial regions to set up the green building like standards. And for in the industry sector, we saw a lot of like provincial regions actually set up the intensity reduction targets in the industry sector. The targets actually are most of the targets actually are higher than the national targets. And in transportation, we already have like 10 provincial regions actually have like targets for percentage of new energy vehicles in total car sales by 2025. So we also have an analysis to see how green the public investment at the subnational level. So what we saw is currently the green projects still only account for a small portion of all key projects. So with these climate targets, we use the scenario analysis to see the emission gaps they still have to achieve carbon neutrality. What we did is we use our a model we call the energy policy simulator, and selected 2 provinces. One is Guangdong and one is Jiangxi to look at the emission gaps they have. So what we have found is in these 2 provinces, early carbon peaking actually is achievable, but the peaking time could be different. For example, in Guangdong, their carbon emissions could peak around like 2025 in the policy scenario, but in Jiangxi, the peaking time would be around like 2030. And based on this, our analysis, here are some like recommendations. Because there is no central government for local government to have like a carbon neutrality roadmap. So we think it'd be important to develop a long-term subnational climate action plans toward 2060. And also we saw there were, because of the regional diversity, we saw there were a lot of different, the local areas actually can explore some different practices to reduce carbon emissions, to bridge the emission gaps. And we saw there are, and another recommendation is about non-CO2 emissions, because currently we saw there are a lot of policies focused on the CO2 emissions reductions, but actually the non-CO2 emissions could be hard to abate and needs more attention. So we actually collected all this, we did our analysis based on a policy, an online policy database. We call it China Carbon Neutrality Tracker. And if you're interested in the national and subnational carbon neutrality policies, you can visit our website. It's bilingual and online, public available. Thank you. And I think I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting to see the details of that research. And I think it'll be really useful for our discussion going forward. So thank you so much. And thank you to the rest of our panelists also for your remarks. And so now we have a set of additional experts with us today to offer some reflections and commentary. So I'll introduce them both first. We have Alex Wong with us today, who is Professor of Law at UCLA School of Law and the Faculty Co-Director of the Emmett Institute on Climate Change and the Environment. He's also a co-chair of the Academic Advisory Committee for the California-China Climate Institute. His research focuses on law and politics of Chinese environmental governance. We also have with us Amy Holm, who's the Executive Director of the Climate Registry, a nonprofit organization based in Los Angeles that connects, educates, and empowers both public and private organizations with the resources to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Amy has also led the Climate Registry's efforts to amplify the work and opportunities for public and private stakeholders through hosting the annual Climate Leadership Conference and Award Program, as well as organizing U.S. delegations to attend the UNFCCC's COP events. So welcome to both of you, and I'll hand it over to Alex. Alex, we can't hear you. No.
How's that? Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect.
Sorry about that. So thanks so much for the terrific presentations. I've just returned from 2 weeks in Beijing, where I had a chance to meet with experts on climate and environment for the first time since before COVID. And so just a few observations about that visit. One, the setting sort of put climate impacts in one's mind. It was over 105 degrees Fahrenheit on many of the days I was in Beijing. And at the same time, we were having the wildfires in Canada that had such an impact all over the United States as well. So hopefully those impacts put our respective leaders in the mind of accelerating climate action. A few observations about Beijing. It was absolutely stunning to see how the electric vehicle situation had changed since I was last in Beijing in 2019. Electric vehicles were absolutely everywhere. My understanding was about 90% of the local taxi fleet had converted to electric vehicles. Of course, given China's electricity mix, still very coal heavy, electric vehicles are not a solution to climate change yet, but it is certainly a step, and it shows the promise of China's clean tech push and the possibilities from in transportation and electricity in particular. I had discussions with people about the issue of coal. This is the #1 question that foreigners tend to ask Chinese interlocutors. And a lot of people raised the fact that issues of security and self-sufficiency were paramount in what leaders were thinking about. So Joanna had framed it as a central local issue, which it of course is, but also there seems to be issues, dynamics of just sort of concerns about energy security and self-sufficiency, and frankly, the role that geopolitical tensions play in creating that instability that makes it even harder to do climate policy. Another observation just about where the U.S. is, the fact that the U.S. has real climate action at the federal level now, compared to the last time I was in China, makes an enormous amount of difference. Before, we could always talk about California and state level actions, but now you really have the most substantial federal level climate actions in the Inflation Reduction Act and the other relevant laws. And then finally, just to say that I think Chinese experts were very excited and we're looking forward to the opportunity to engage with visitors from outside, just as I and others were very excited to be able to engage with Chinese experts again. It seemed like a lot of people from the United States and elsewhere were in Beijing that same month, and it was really felt important to have that chance to interact again. And so just that brings me to this issue of cooperation and Kerry's visit this week. As Biden came into office, a lot of us had been discussing about whether cooperation or competition was more important. But this visit for me could not have really reminded me more just how important that collaboration can be. Just that ability to share ideas and to put minds together to solve important problems together. It really just could not be more important, that information sharing aspect, but also the sort of mitigation of conflict aspect, the fact that we can all get together and talk to avoid misunderstandings and sort of understand where each side is coming from. Those very basic things are incredibly important. Things that I expect will be on the table this week with the Kerry visit. I think the coal issue in China will be a big issue. As I think will be the environmental impacts of Chinese overseas investments in trade. I think that will be a big topic. I think for the U.S. side, to give some sort of sense of, for example, can the U.S. continue to act on its climate promises, given the very nature of our political system, that we may have a very different administration in place in a few years. And so what happens to our climate commitments that we were talking about now? A lot of Chinese people were asking about this. And also, we heard a lot of concern on the Chinese side about CBAM and border tax adjustments, and what are the potential impacts of something like that. And so a part of what I hope will come out of the visit is that Kerry and Xie can talk about ways to make sure that this sort of geopolitical dynamic does not turn into something corrosive or destructive, because we simply can't afford to have anything that slows down climate action. And then just a few final thoughts on subnational action. Of course, we'll be learning from the subnational leaders like California and other states in the United States. And also, I think still too few people appreciate how important subnational competition and innovation has been in the Chinese system, right? I appreciate the IGDP breakdown, unpacking of the different provinces, because it'll help us to understand and learn the stories of the different provinces and learn from the specific places where they're doing it differently than other provinces within China, right? That story is not very well known, maybe even within China, but certainly not outside of China. The other area I hope we can work on is how the U.S. and China can talk about moving subnational laggards, right? We know that in each of our countries, there are provinces and states that are behind. And so what can we do? In the United States, for example, the Inflation Reduction Act, they tried to spread benefits to those states that tended to oppose climate action, to try to get them to see the economic benefits of moving forward on climate. We need to know more about how China is doing that. How are we meeting barriers, for example, to grid reform? Provinces tending to want to have too much energy capacity within their provinces rather than sharing capacity across borders, for example. And then, can subnational actors also help to ameliorate or mitigate national concerns that are barriers to climate action? Some of the stated concerns at the national level in both countries are worries about jobs, transitions, just transition, environmental justice, these sorts of things. To the extent that local jurisdictions can help to solve those problems or find a pathway forward, find jobs for those who will lose coal jobs, for example, in the transition, that can help to break through some of the barriers at the national level. And so then on the specific areas of cooperation, there are many of them: methane, clean energy transition, carbon markets, these sorts of things. I just want to mention one that we've discussed in a few of my meetings recently, which is Global South cooperation. I think what we're clearly seeing is China is moving in the same direction that the U.S. and Europe moved in the past, which is one of moving towards lower polluting industries, and then a lot of the polluting industries are moving offshore. So China is clearly going through that process as well. How do we short circuit that in the global south now and ensure that we just don't have a shifting of emissions, but really a way to help the global south leapfrog and take advantage of clean energy and clean transportation and these sorts of technologies that are now becoming much more available. So I'll just stop there and look forward to having a discussion with all of you.
Thanks, Alex. Brought up a lot of interesting questions. I hope we'll get a chance to chat about some of them. Amy, please go ahead.
Thank you. I hope my microphone is working. And great, success. Thank you, everybody. So nice to be here. Thank you, Fan and Jessica and the California-China Climate Institute for inviting me to participate in this wonderful event. It's been great hearing from everybody. I really enjoyed and appreciate Alex's report recent report from his trip to Beijing. That was really interesting and great to hear that kind of on the ground perspective, and it sounds very positive, so that's also wonderful to note. I will try to keep my remarks fairly brief because I know that there's a number of attendees participating tonight, and I want to make sure that there's a chance for a good question and answer period with the presenters. But I did have a few takeaways that I wanted to convey as I had read the report and then was looking and then was listening today. And I think one of my main takeaways is that the breakthroughs in tackling tough global issues like climate change requires the constructive engagement, as Joanna discussed, but it's not necessarily among the like-minded, right? But sometimes among the unlike-minded. And to accomplish this, I would suggest that subnational actors in U.S. and China need to continue to execute a policy that I'll call, it's a kind of a psychological term, but compartmentalization. So that's the process or coping strategy of singling out a problem and putting all your energy and attention to it and not getting too distracted about other things. And so the three areas that really stood out to me as good opportunities or drivers for collaboration in this compartmentalized landscape are, the first one is something that Zhu referenced, which was made in China. And we should recognize that there's great potential for mutual and multifaceted benefits when U.S. and China subnationals engage to advance the green economy and low carbon transition goals. For example, in 2020, China's electric vehicle maker BYD was a major part of the largest order of electric buses in American history to the City of Los Angeles Department of Transportation. So, and to ensure clean operation of electric buses, LADWT, so Los Angeles Department of Transportation, also built a new 3-acre maintenance yard, and it also features solar panel canopies over the yard. And BYD also began pilot programs with the Los Angeles International Airport, LAX, and the University of California at Los Angeles. So the goal is to make LA Department of Transportation's bus fleet entirely emission-free in time for the opening ceremonies of the 2028 Olympic and Paralympic Games. So this one project just kept on, it became a garden of projects and activities that kept growing and will benefit many, many people over years to come. I'd also like to emphasize the comments made by Mayan and Alex around the opportunities to share information. And this can include aligning on best practices, which is like around GHG data accounting policies, which are tending to be very complicated and developing fast and furious with various reporting, mandatory, possibly national reporting schemes. And there is a lot of opportunity around work around this. Tracking and understanding current emissions trends, modeling potential outcomes, and assessing climate risks. And so this activity requires policy development, data collection, research, and analysis, all of which provide many opportunities for technical exchanges we're having here tonight, shared academic papers, scientific platforms, and maybe one of the most important outcomes, which is that this sharing of information continues to drive ingenuity and inventiveness to keep improving and developing innovative climate solutions and technologies. And lastly, the challenge and potential areas for subnational collaboration today highlights, I think, a very important takeaway for us all to remember, especially as we know, things change, and that means policy change, and the way we operate in the world internationally changes. And that is that it's really important not to rely on a bottom-up or a top-down approach. Subnational actors need to be very nimble and to utilize both skill sets to deploy in achieving climate objectives. And that will kind of vacillate depending on the specifics of the opportunity and the wider landscape that we're operating in. And so, for example, during 2016 to 2020, U.S. subnational jurisdictions began to engage in signing MOUs on climate activities more aggressively with foreign countries, and California was very engaged in acting almost like a nation state, as were other states. Some of these countries that the subnationals were talking to were also pulling back on climate collaboration with the U.S. federal government because of the lack of the opportunity for movement. Once the Biden administration began seriously engaging on climate action again, international opportunities as well as bottom-up activities continued, but they gave way to top-down strategies to drive climate action in the U.S., driven by legislation, IRA, and finance that supports clean energy deployment and energy infrastructure reinvestment to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We hope that will continue, but we have to be able to deploy different strategies depending on the situation that we find ourselves. And I'll just leave my comments with a final quote from John Kerry, Biden's special envoy on climate, who will be traveling to China soon, as Alex noted. And he has persistently stressed the importance of China to U.S.-China climate policy. He said, climate is the one area that should not be subject to interruption because of issues that do affect us. And so I'd just like to leave you with that today and say thank you for including me.
Thank you, Amy, for those great remarks. Yeah, I really appreciated your examples and also talking about the need for subnationals to be nimble as the situation changes. So now we've reached the time in our program that we would like to turn to audience questions. So if you have a question for our panelists, I just encourage you to add it into the Q&A box that is at the base of your screen. And just to start us off with questions that are in the chat already. So we've been talking a lot about opportunities here, but there's a question about challenges. So what do we see as the biggest challenge for subnational entities in the U.S. and China to enact effective climate policies, and what are some ways these challenges could be addressed? Anybody want to take a shot at that one?
I can take a crack on that, just bringing my opinion and observation in terms of challenges oftentimes faced by subnationals. I think there are a couple of those, particularly capacity. A lot of the times when it comes to subnationals making, targets or, planning for some actions, the capacity actually varies from one subnational to another subnational, and oftentimes some of these targets are being made top down. So I think we see a lot of example, actually great example of subnationals implementing those plans and executing the plans and taking action, but not necessarily at the very initial stage, let's say planning for some kind of reduction target. I think there is a bit of capacity restrictions or challenges at the subnational level, as well as a kind of lag behind some of those policy making at the national or the federal level. But I think, California oftentimes have been referred as an exception where we could, drive a lot of actions. But, California is actually quite uniquely, a very unique subnational in terms of when it comes to climate actions. So I think that's one kind of challenges. And the other I would also kind of point to at the very technical level, we often refer to inventory, monitoring and reporting, like MRV. These things are not easy. So subnationals, and particularly with some sectors, they just kind of don't, and it's again maybe a capacity issue. They just don't have that solid of capacity to do those, build from scratch. At the national or federal level, we often have more institutions that were able to do those. So I think that's another area I see some challenges, and that would also lead to issues with data transparency, how much we can disclose, how much we know, and we could measure each other, in terms of their actions and progress.
Thanks, Diane. There's another question here in the chat. So we've been talking about Carrie's visit to Beijing, and there is some talk that maybe there could be some joint action on methane coming out of this visit, and just wondering if there's anyone who has thoughts on whether that's possible, or if there's other steps that might come out of this visit that you'd like to share.
I'm happy to start, and maybe others have thoughts. I think we're all speculating what might come out of this visit. I think it's first and foremost, it's just very important that it's happening. I think, clearly this trip has been delayed a few times, and this is really going to be the first substantive meeting at that level on this topic, in many months now. And I think it's important that the meeting happens. I think it's important that some kind of positive agenda comes out of this meeting, even if it's, simply an agreement to continue to meet, would be, I think, extremely important, to really reestablish these direct channels of communication out of the State Department and with counterparts in China, particularly in the lead up to COP28, which is, going to be an important meeting, and where it's going to be really crucial that the U.S. and China have opportunities to engage in advance of that. That's not the only reason, but it's certainly one sort of upcoming event. And particularly, we don't know how long, either Special Envoy Kerry or or Xi are going to be in office, I think that we really both of our countries sort of rely on these two leaders to push the bilateral relationship forward on climate change. I think it would just be very important, if not just to get specific outcomes, but to really agree on a process to make sure that bilateral engagement is not sort of derailed so easily again. In terms of specific actions, though, I think methane is certainly on the table. It's certainly been a big interest of the U.S. government to engage with China on this topic. I think there are ways China could engage in some of the multilateral efforts on methane as well, the Global Methane Pledge and others. And I think, whether we see a new joint statement or some sort of action plan or schedule, released as a result of this meeting, I think anything that can sort of build on the Glasgow bilateral, joint announcement and lay out some more concrete steps of what we could be doing together is helpful. And, at the end of the day, it's not that, this meeting is going to, we're not just relying on the sort of track one bilateral engagement, right? I think that's part of what this webinar is about, is how important all the other activities are, but and ultimately it is about implementation, right? Not sort of high level diplomatic signals, but those signals are also just so crucial, because when things go awry, they really can, I think, derail the bilateral relationship much more broadly, right? And make it much harder, for people at the working level to even have meetings, have conversations, and sort of get the real work done. So I'm really hoping that, we see some positive and tangible outcomes from this visit.
Thanks for your thoughts, Joanna. We have another question in the chat here asking,
我可以说话吗？
可以。
谢谢。我发现我们这个在这个碳的领域，女士们女性比较多啊，非常好。这个我觉得刚才两个问题，一个是在这个甲烷方面的合作，这个我觉得在中国方面，只要我们中央政府明确了我们的努力方向，在这个方面我们一点合作是没有任何问题。还是要加强合作。而且我觉得从我看到的一些资料来看，上次这个谢振华特使和克里一起在谈判的时候，已经涉及到中国甲烷的减排的问题。只要把这样一个任务纳入到我们的这个指标里面来，考核指标里面，应该来说在这个方面合作肯定有空间。因为中国在甲烷减排的能力方面，跟美国之间还是有很多需要我们之间相互交流、进行沟通的一些地方。因为美国的农业，它跟我们在中国来看的话，它对于这个我们的东北地区它比较相似，地广人稀啊。但是在中国的这个南部地区，它可能就不太一样。像我的江苏，它是一个人多地少，那个田都是水田，一小块一小块，跟美国的这样规模可能还不一样。但是我对于美国也不是很了解啊，我只是自己孤陋寡闻说一点点。但是我觉得我们双方之间合作非常非常重要，这是我想第一个。第二个呢，因为我原来担任过镇江市的市长，我在镇江的时候就在推动镇江作为低碳城市的建设。当时我参加过中美这个绿色领袖峰会，参加过2届，一届是在美国，一届是在这个中国。我觉得这样的这个带领呢，觉得你中美中美像一个就这个研究院还可以发挥一个作用，把这个原来这个机制啊，还再提高一点。因为我们两国是都是碳排放的大国，中国有中国的这个优势，美国有美国的优势，这个我觉得我们两个在面对人类共同的应对气候变化的话，两国之间真是应该合作要大于竞争，就是合作应该在这个当中大于竞争，我们应该加强合作，共同面对人类面临的共同的这样这个气候变化这样的难题和这样的问题。 所以在这个当中，我希望呢，就是我们是否能够在以这样一个形式搭建一个什么平台呢？有科研，搭建一个双方之间的交流，定期来进行交流。这里面不光是政府，也要有科研单位，有大学，有企业，有政府，有社会组织，各个方面共同来交流。那么这个活动呢，应该不是一个就是临时性的，而是在我们应对气候变化这个当中，应该是一个常态性的一种机制来交流。因为我在研究院，我是从政府转到研究院来工作的，感觉到我们在这个当中还是有很多需要合作交流的空间。我刚才为什么感谢戴主任？我们在做这个南京市、苏州市的路径研究的时候，我们就要有算法，但实际上你们美国劳伦斯实验室已经研究了这个路径的算法，实际上但是呢，那个算法是基于美国的这样的国情和你们的一些数据的支撑。那么中国的国情是什么？就需要我们之间加强这样的合作，这是一。比如说第二个，就是你刚才你们也讲到了，美国之间，因为你们美国是两党制，它各个州之间有的党是民主党，有的党是共和党，那么他可能对应对气候变化这件事情，他可能认识不完全一致。它跟中国不一样，中国我们只要中央政府一声令下，那么各个地方必须按照这个要求来去做，它有一套指标体系来考核你。那么在这个当中，美国之间，我们中美之间怎么能加强合作，把中国一些好的做法和美国的一些这样的怎么能够融入美国的这个治理体系当中呢？同时，美国的一些治理方式，特别像你们在这个法律法规方面出来哪些法律，比如说加州要对这个建筑进行这个零碳建筑的建设，你们率先是出台法律的，这个法律对于我们中国，我们就在这方面就有一些合作，就是这样来把这个事情，我们共同把这个事情做好，相互学习、相互借鉴，有一个交流的地方。包括在技术方面，也有很多的一些技术。你比如说，现在这个关于人造钙钛矿的这样的研究，它也有些技术是很超前，已经开始在做这样。如果这样能把它做出来的话，对我们的光伏产业，对我们的光电转化效率，会是个非常大的提升。这样好的事情，为什么就一家独享呢？应该是人类共享，共同推动我们人类的这个应对气候变化，让我们的生活更加好。我就这个。
Thank you, Julie Lauscher. So just for this, I'm going to ask one final question and hope that a few of you can jump in on it, kind of combining a few of the questions that are in the chat together. So just curious in what you all see as some of the ripest areas for subnational cooperation between the U.S. and China. Wondering whether offshore wind might be an area that you see as good for cooperation, particularly with California and China. And then also wondering people's thoughts about, how do we best further this cooperation at this time, and whether you see any way for subnational action to maybe be formalized within climate commitments, either in the UNFCCC or in other venues. So there's kind of multiple parts to that, and just welcome anyone to answer any piece of that appeals to you.
I'll chime in with some random thoughts. I was actually going to respond to Kate Logan's question about the economic headwinds, which was less featured in your summary. But I guess that question reflects still a common way reaction you get to whether we can move quickly on climate action, and it just seems that that mindset we really need to, as a general matter, see if we can overcome, because concerns about economic issues do slow climate action, yet people aren't recognizing that we are now facing billions and billions of dollars of immediate damage and costs from climate change. And there's obviously a problem with the mismatch of you could potentially invest a lot of money in climate action and still in the short term get those kind of costs of climate disaster, for example. But in the long term, it would it would be hard to imagine that it wouldn't pay off in a big way. So somehow we need to move beyond that mindset, even though of course it's a very immediate issue for the people impacted.
Thanks. Any other final thoughts here, either on places for collaboration?
I'll chime in quickly on the question of actually from David Woolley about the cooperation between U.S., California, and China and regional governments in China actually on the offshore wind energy. I think we do recognize the need for more solutions for decarbonization of the energy sector, and offshore wind is a one kind of renewable that I know California has really robust targets, set up robust targets, and China also has really great on the ground developments already. I think when it comes to collaboration, the scale of development in China could be a really good example for how we could potentially replicate in the States. And I think also in terms of the innovation needed for scaling up this solution, both would be ideal that, not just the US and China, like California and maybe other places could work together for the R&D and the scaling and manufacturing and scaling of these solutions. So I think there is good opportunity for that collaboration. And then one last note on the formalization of subnationals in the kind of different channels. I do think it would be ideal and necessary to somehow formalize subnationals' role in those different mechanisms that we're talking about, both international, national, and some bilateral mechanism. I'm not quite sure how that could be captured in the NDCs. I think maybe others could offer more insights on that, but I feel like the UNFCCC process has some room for informal and formal kind of inclusion of subnationals action, and I think that could be an area. Hopefully, we see some breakthrough at COP28. And I'm looking at Amy, our expert on a lot of things related to COP. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that as well.
Well, thank you, Fan, and I'm looking at Joanna too for her comments. And a great question, Kate. I was like, thinking about that. I mean, I think the challenge that I see with a lot of the NDCs and aspects about how they're figured out is, the double counting, and which is always the bugaboo in carbon accounting, is double counting, and how you'd separate that out in terms of each country being able to allocate a certain amount of whatever the cooperative agreement is into their NDC. So it's an interesting idea. I'd be very interested to explore kind of the implementation and how that mechanism could work. And I think I see somebody here who's somebody's offering to answer the question for us. So maybe she'll solve all our problems.
That's one of the CCCI stuff on the back end. I don't know, Joanna, do you have anything you want to say as the last word?
Sure. I mean, just very briefly, I think that I don't know if it's necessarily to incorporate subnational action formally into the UNFCCC commitments, but I do think it's very important for them to be sort of articulated and present within the context of the negotiations. I mean, I think we saw that so clearly sort of during the Trump administration years in the US, where it was so important to sort of remind the international community that the executive branch, is not sort of the only voice of, US climate policy, and that there's so much happening. And I think likewise, it's, as we see from the presentations from our Chinese colleagues, there's so much diversity in climate policy implementation at the subnational level, plenty of provinces and municipalities that are far more ambitious than the national goals. And I think we tend to sort of look at the sort of the negative stories, right, and the coal builds, and these are indeed happening, but not everywhere, right, and so I think there's a lot of diversity in implementation, and it's just very important to understand that as we are sort of moved into this implementation phase of implementing the NDCs.
Thank you. Zhu Laoshi, I think you wanted to say something before we close.
我们两个研究院在加州与江苏方面，我们率先做一个这个示范，可以吗？我们两个研究院先合作。如果你同意的话，我就开始，就是因为中国我们有我们的管理的方式，我得去，不能说我说了就算，然后我得去按照这个方式来进行这个审批，来批准了以后，然后我们来进行合作。我觉得这个应该是我们的政府、我们的学校应该都会支持这样的一个合作。
That sounds like a great plan. So with that hope of future collaboration between the U.S. and China, I would just like to thank all of our panelists as well as our audience members for joining today. Really appreciate your engagement and questions. I know I learned a lot from all of you. It was really interesting discussion. This event has been recorded and it will be available on the California-China Climate Institute's website and YouTube channel. I also encourage you all to take a look at the paper and have a wonderful morning or evening wherever you are. And thank you so much.